In this paper, I write about using the evidence of Persian religion and belief in Herodotus' The Histories to prove the presence of Zoroastrianism. I intend to do this by taking the select chapters and comparing them with both written and archaeological evidence of Zoroastrian practices. The basis of my findings are mainly sourced from Book 1 of the 9, excerpt from Herodotus, with translation by George Rawlinson. Though the evidence I find is in a large section of the book, it gives insight into early Persian religion, which I will prove to be Zoroastrianism. The first chapter which gives significant mention to the Persians' religious practice comes in chapter 131 of Book 1. From this point, we are already able to recognize the Zoroastrian ideology present by the mention of Mithra, a Zoroastrian deity, though we are faced with an interesting statement from Herodotus. Herodotus tells us the customs of their religion, making mention to a lack of imagery, temples, and altars. This provides an interesting dilemma, for evidence and practices still present in Zoroastrian today involves an altar, specifically turning towards a hearth or source of light while praying. This is interesting because there is evidence of early Western altars and open-air places of worship in the western mountains of Iran. He could have possibly been associating their practices with ones observed in his own culture. Evidence of this possibility comes from his statement that the Persians offer sacrifice to Jupiter on the peak. One possibility could make up for the lack of temples, proven by Dr. Klaus Shipman. His research led him to the conclusion that many of the possible fire temples of Zoroastrianism were likely military posts, watchtowers, or private dwellings. Another historian, Stig Wikander, also supported the notion. He stated, "Worship was offered to the divine beings without aid of temples, altars, or statues, and that all that was needed for the sanctifying high rituals was a clean, flat piece of ground, pure from pollution." Vesta, a sacred Zoroastrian text on ritual, there is no identifiable information which alludes the ritual flame to be practiced in a temple. The first reference of this kind comes in the Vendad, a combined work which final edition is attributed to after the Hellenistic period, possibly as late as the 1st or 2nd century AD. The only other primary evidence stating the fire temples is a phrase spoken by Darius, which uses the word ayadana, which is derived from the word yada, to worship. It could have been used to mean place of worship, referring to temples. Though this information is purely speculative, and due to the nature of Darius's words could indicate the open-air altars addressed earlier. Herodotus also observes the Persians' practices, stating they worship and offer to the sun, the moon, the earth, fire, water, and to the winds. Now this part is purely speculative on my behalf, but it could deal with the daily prayer, yasna. Another approach would be to suggest he gained knowledge of all the major deities and categorized them regardless of prayer, ritual, or place amongst the realms of heaven. This would mean that the offerings viewed by Herodotus were not seen over a couple days, but months, as the frequency of some rituals vary. Another interesting part of this section of evidence, which proves the elements of Zoroastrianism in the Persian religion, comes from the final sentence in the passage. It states the Persians began worship of Mithra, who is a deity and in the Zoroastrian beliefs. In the next passage, Herodotus gives a first-hand account of a ritual performed by the Persians. Many of the scholars which discuss this passage claim Herodotus, as an outsider looking in on these practices, might have made generalizations or paid less attention to the specific process, which may account for inaccuracies. One of the characteristics which we know about Zoroastrianism is the presence of fire, the sacred flame, and often symbolized the radiating power of Ahura Mazda. Rituals often did require fire, but only in the absence of the sun. Another significant aspect of Zoroastrianism, which Herodotus mentions in this passage, is the characteristic of pollution and purification. Pollution was viewed as the work of the evil spirit spreading harm and suffering. Rituals of purification, however, were used as techniques of combating this pollution. Herodotus tells us how in the ritual involved a prayer which addressed the Persians as a whole. Often rituals in Zoroastrianism were used as a unifying force, invoking a sense of fellowship amongst the community of worshippers who believed to be fighting evil and striving towards the purification and transformation of the world. In this passage, and throughout the book, Herodotus mentions the Magi. Though little is known about them, the Magi are one of the 6 tribes which divided from the Medes. This tribe was considered divine and later became known as the priesthood of early Zoroastrian religion and held religious authority among the Medes and the Persians. In chapter 140 of Book 1, Herodotus gives mention to the Zoroastrians' unique burial technique. It is known as the rite of exposure. This consisted of leaving the corpse in the open where vultures and scavenging beasts, such as dogs, would quickly devour it. This left the soul to be drawn into the sunlight of Ahura Mazda, then the bones were buried. Evidence of this Zoroastrian practice is supported by the creation of the stone surface towers to expose their dead, which they called by the old word dakma, which can also be translated to the giving place. One called the Tower of Silence still exists today on Malabar Hill in Bombay. By thorough investigation of these few passages, we are able to observe the relationship between rituals, prayers, and practices of Herodotus's Persian religion and Zoroastrianism.